Television franchises do not die. They simply learn new ways to be embalmed. Dexter has become a particularly instructive specimen. Every continuation arrives with solemn assurances of deeper exploration, then promptly requests amnesia about the last set of creative decisions. The audience, predictably, responds by doing what the writers often refuse to do, imposing structure, hunting for causality, and trying to make the pieces behave as though they belong to the same puzzle rather than a rotating display of whatever fits the episode runtime. The most ambitious attempt at forcing order onto the chaos is the conspiracy that begins with Dexter New Blood and escalates into a theory of Leon Prater as puppet master. The premise is grand in the way only grand premises can be. Kurt Caldwell, the previous season's villain, is presumed to be part of Prater's club. Because Kurt's trophy system requires stable conditions and secrecy, the theory proposes he did not pay Prater with a physical trophy at all. Instead, he allegedly shared something more valuable: access to the feeds from cameras installed inside his trophy basement. Cameras, notably, that would have captured Dexter speaking freely in the one place where he inexplicably indulged his inner monologue out loud. On this account, Prater did not merely collect, he listened. He heard Dexter confess to being the Bay Harbor butcher. He heard the term dark passenger. He heard the mythology, the self-justification, the ritual language. In short, he received the series' most protected information via a villain's CCTV package, as if the franchise were finally interested in consequences that travel beyond a single season. From that hinge, the theory expands with the confidence of a plan that has never met a continuity error. Dexter's injury and 10-week coma become narrative gold, a time window for Prater to put everything in place. The claim is that Prater, armed with inside knowledge, arranged the entire scenario, right down to media manipulation. The dark passenger label in this reading did not organically appear in the cultural bloodstream. It was introduced or amplified by influence, because Prater knew that specific phrase would hook Dexter instantly. The killer branded with Dexter's private vocabulary would become irresistible bait. Dexter would hear the term, fixate, and move, precisely as scripted. The invitation to the club, therefore, becomes not an accident, but a premeditated lure. Certain intermediaries, Blessing for instance, are positioned as potential collaborators, feeding Dexter information because Prater wants the master at close range. And in that grimly theatrical framing, Prater's motive is not to stop Dexter or expose him, but to enjoy the performance. Dexter is not a threat to neutralize, he is entertainment. When Dexter deviates from the expected script by not killing someone like Lady V, Prater's frustration allegedly surfaces as narrative pressure. The theory goes further. Prater might even compromise himself to keep the game alive, perhaps helping Lady V escape rather than killing her, simply to increase the pressure on Dexter and force the desired outcome. Even Angela's decisions are folded into the same engine. If she backs down, it is not because of her own psychology or the plot's needs, but because Prater, through influence and intimidation, offered her a choice: leave town with money or keep pushing and endanger her daughter. She chooses the cash and the exit, because the conspiracy requires Prater to be the answer to everything. It is an impressive act of scaffolding. It is also, by any reasonable standard, a heroic act of over-engineering on behalf of a franchise that has historically treated plausibility as an optional subscription tier. The objections are not nitpicks, they are structural. The first issue is visibility. Kurt Caldwell's operation depended on the town not knowing there was a serial killer at all. The victims were framed as runaways. That concealment is the point. If Prater's club recruits by scanning media stories, then Kurt is precisely the wrong kind of killer to recruit. No headlines, no myth, no curated notoriety. Without public exposure, Prater would have no obvious reason to know Kurt exists, let alone to fold him into a social circle of trophy collectors. The theory's workaround is to assume Prater's reach extends into private darkness without any signal. At that point, the club is not a collector's hobby. It is a surveillance state. The second issue is linguistic. Dark passenger is not an in-universe cultural phrase with broad circulation. It is overwhelmingly a term Dexter uses internally and only rarely externalizes. The list of people he has set it to is limited, and the premise that it would leak in the media discourse, right on schedule, conveniently during Dexter's coma window, requires a chain of events that the franchise would need to show with unusual discipline. Discipline is not a consistent feature of this universe. The third issue is geography and identity. The invitation is addressed to Red. The dinner is for Red. The theory requires Prater to predict not only Dexter's presence in New York, but the exact chain of coincidences that would swap Dexter into Red's seat. This is not clever plotting. It is reverse justification. It is the narrative equivalent of missing a train, arriving at the platform anyway, and insisting the conductor plan the delay as a personal gift. Then come the auxiliary claims that push the theory from ambitious to implausible. Making Blessing a killer or secret collaborator is the kind of twist that does not read like revelation. It reads like a writer's room throwing darts at a board labeled shock value. Likewise, Angela has not been characterized as someone who folds easily under threats. A sudden retreat would require groundwork. Without it, the theory ends up serving as a patch for characterization. When actions do not align with the established persona, a shadowy mastermind is invoked to cover the seams. And yet, for all its improbability, the conspiracy theory is illuminating. It exposes what the audience is starving for: coherence and consequences. The franchise keeps dangling the moral reckoning and then pulling it away at the last moment, as if the story might break if it were forced to look directly at what it has been enjoying. So the audience tries to build the missing architecture itself. That hunger manifests most clearly in the recurring demand for an actual, sustained aftermath when Dexter is finally caught. A full season, a courtroom season, a procedural war, not against a weakly villain, but against the idea of Dexter himself. The fantasy is not subtle. The series finale should have been an extended courtroom drama after exposure, with the franchise finally cashing the checks it has been writing since season 1. The defense argument is already drafted in the audience's head, because the show has carefully curated Dexter's victims to make that argument emotionally plausible. The prosecution will tell you he broke the law. Yes. The police benefited. Also yes. When the system failed, he acted. That is the franchise's central seduction. The defense's most chilling point is also the show's favorite safety rail. No innocent person has been proven to be among his victims. They are murderers, rapists, predators. In that framing, Dexter becomes the system's unofficial sanitation department, and the show forces the viewer to confront whether that made them comfortable, and why. The courtroom season fantasy expands into a public reaction arc, because the public, in this genre, is the final mirror. The imagined world splits into factions. Some people would support Dexter and protest outside the courthouse, framing him as a folk hero, a dark avenger, a necessary corrective when institutions fail. Others would insist that vigilante murder remains murder, no matter how selectively curated the victim list may be. Others would be indifferent, because indifference is the modern survival instinct. Meanwhile, the grotesque celebrity machine would spin up instantly. Fan mail, love letters, romantic obsession, because society has a long, shameful tradition of turning violent men into commodities. And Dexter's old colleagues would become collateral damage in the public's appetite. Masuka horrified, Quinn disgusted. The department forced to reckon with the idea that their lab guy was not simply adjacent to evil, but the author of a particularly curated version of it. That desire for public reckoning is paired with another, Dexter on the run, for long enough that the code begins to crack. The most interesting version of this story is not heroic. It is panicked. It is necessity corroding restraint. It is Dexter improvising, making uglier choices, and discovering what happens when the calm ritual is replaced by survival pressure. This is where the show's swaggering line finally becomes meaningful. Dexter does not run. He makes people run. The fantasy is a Dexter who is hunted, not comfortably hunting, and who starts to lose the moral neatness that the series uses to keep him palatable. The franchise has flirted with that idea for years, and then backed away, afraid to make its protagonist truly difficult to endorse. A run arc would force the issue. Instead, the narrative keeps dragging the audience back to smaller questions with disproportionate consequences, like whether Dexter should be worried about recognition at Prater's club. In a world that respected its own premise, the anxiety would be constant. Dexter worked at Miami Metro alongside James Dokes, the official Bay Harbor butcher. Dexter's wife was killed by Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity killer. Prater is obsessed with serial killers, trophies, memorabilia, and the mythology around them. The obvious fear is not merely being seen, it is being cataloged. The counterargument is that recognition is less likely than paranoia suggests. Most people do not remember the spouse of a victim. Trinity killed many, and expecting a collector to remember the husband of one late-career victim by face requires either recent research or an unusual memory. Officially, Dexter was not the public face of the Bay Harbor butcher case. Dokes was. Whatever doubts Angel or Maria had were not public knowledge. Dexter is not in the FBI mythos as the killer. He is, at most, a background technician, a name in a departmental roster. In that framing, Prater could plausibly know the killers while remaining indifferent to the peripheral humans. But even if recognition is unlikely, suspicion is inevitable, because suspicion does not require a photographic memory. It requires logistics. The club issues phones, and phones are a modern leash. Tracking is not far-fetched. It is basic operational security. Red disappears, and employment systems eventually flag missing employees. An apartment without its tenant raises questions. Rent still exists. A landlord still knocks. Payroll still expects attendance. The most credible move would be to discard the club-issued phone immediately, perhaps leaving it at Red's apartment to maintain the illusion of presence, because otherwise the story collapses under the weight of ordinary administration. That mundane pressure leads to another mundane but persistent question. How does Dexter maintain the financial cover? The franchise invites the absurd image of a man balancing homicide with rent payments and employment accountability. It is almost comic. How long until Red's job reports him missing? Does Dexter need to pay Red's rent to avoid scrutiny? Is a cover job actually a responsibility in this universe? Or is it merely a decorative prop that exists until the next plot twist needs it? The darkest version of that financial thread is also the most consistent with the show's occasional implications. If money is needed quickly, Dexter might start taking shortcuts, stealing cash from victims, raiding wallets, exploiting the untraceable economics of crime. The franchise rarely dwells on this because it would mean admitting that the code is a costume, not a moral ecosystem. But the logic sits there, uncomfortably. Murder logistics are expensive, and the show cannot keep pretending the blood spatter salary alone funds an entire covert infrastructure. Defenders of Dexter's finances point to plausible stabilizers: inheritance from Harry, the sale of assets, a stable salary, modest visible spending, mortgages and loans, the reality that earlier decades were cheaper. Some even suggest investments, because Dexter is portrayed as intelligent and controlled. Add in the inheritance from his biological father's house, and the cushion begins to look plausible on paper. Then the expenses insist on being acknowledged. Childcare is expensive. Part-time or overnight nannies are not free. Boats require maintenance, fuel, and storage. Tools, chemicals, protective gear, cleanup materials, and disposal logistics add up. A second apartment, when the story introduces one, is a major cost. The franchise occasionally gestures at these realities and then retreats, leaving the audience to decide whether Dexter is financially brilliant, quietly criminal in petty ways, or simply living in a world where costs do not exist unless they create drama. The conversation about recognition and finances eventually circles back to Prater's purpose, because the club storyline invites a larger question. What is the narrative endgame? If Prater does not know who Dexter is, the story still needs a reason for Prater's fixation to intersect meaningfully with Dexter's life. If Prater does know, the story needs a plausible chain of discovery that does not rely on supernatural coincidence. Otherwise, the club becomes another decorative set, an aesthetic of obsession without a coherent thematic destination. One attempt to add plausibility is to emphasize LaGuerta's accusation. Dexter was not merely adjacent to the Bay Harbor Butcher myth, he was once targeted as the Bay Harbor Butcher. That fact, if it exists in any public or semi-public record, should be catnip for someone like Prater. Add the coincidence that the accused man's wife was killed by Trinity, and the pattern starts to look like something a collector might chase, not because of face recognition, but because of data. The point is not that Prater would remember a husband's face. The point is that obsession tends to follow unusual intersections, and Dexter's life is a parade of them. Continuity problems complicate everything. The franchise cannot consistently decide what the world knows about Trinity's final victims, or how internal media, like podcasts, describes the case. One solution is to suggest later confessions. Jonah Mitchell, for instance, altered public understanding. Another solution, more honest, is that continuity is treated as optional unless it benefits the current scene. The return of a showrunner associated with later seasons is sometimes framed as a continuity strategy, an attempt to reduce plot holes by bringing in someone familiar with the existing mess. The irony is unavoidable. A franchise seeking continuity by returning to the era most criticized for narrative slippage is the kind of decision that only makes sense in corporate logic, where familiar is treated as coherent. Dexter's broader cultural status prompts similar accounting. The franchise was extremely popular when it aired. 8 seasons and multiple revivals are not the footprint of obscurity. The reason Dexter does not dominate contemporary anti-hero iconography the way some other characters do is not lack of appeal, it is uneven legacy. The show peaked early and then spent years eroding its own credibility. When a series loses its thread of consequence, when Dexter is never truly in danger of being caught, and the story contorts itself to keep him safe, the narrative becomes less myth and more habit. Habit retains loyal viewers, but it does not always produce lasting cultural shorthand. Timing matters as well. Dexter thrived in an era where television dominance did not automatically translate into the modern social media amplification machine. Some shows exploded later, driven by streaming and binge culture, becoming omnipresent in meme ecosystems. Dexter's popularity was real, but it did not benefit from the same algorithmic afterlife. That does not mean impact was absent, it simply took different forms, including one particularly grim credential. The franchise has been cited as inspiration for copycat killers. If the series needs proof it lodged itself in the public imagination, it has proof of the most unpleasant variety. Cancellations and renewals add another layer of cynicism, because corporate behavior has trained audiences to distrust announcements. A cancellation can trigger a grief cycle response: disbelief, anger, bargaining, resignation, acceptance. Some skip the heavier stages because it is television, not a funeral. Others feel for the cast, because actors are sometimes told a show is renewed, make real-life decisions accordingly, and then watch the promise evaporate. The entertainment industry has enough public cautionary tales that sympathy for performers is not sentimental. It is practical recognition of how disposable labor becomes when metrics shift. That skepticism bleeds into every future promise. Even when a continuation is renewed and apparently performing well, renewed is treated as provisional. The audience does not lack enthusiasm, it lacks trust. Trust has been eroded by the repeated experience of corporate messaging that sells stability until it abruptly sells something else. All of this inevitably returns to the original series finale, because that is where Dexter first performed its most revealing act, dodging the public reckoning it spent years teasing. One camp argues the ending was conceptually fitting. Deb's death, connected to Dexter's decisions, becomes the final strike in a long cascade of collateral damage. Rita dead, Deb dead, Harrison endangered, LaGuerta sacrificed. Dexter is forced into exile, not as escape, but as punishment. He is alive, stripped of connection, living with the emptiness he created. The refusal to arrest him is not cowardice, it is cruelty. Survival is the sentence. The opposing camp often agrees on the core idea and condemns the execution. Season 8 introduced a protege only to discard him almost immediately, as if character development could be crammed into a single week. Dr. Vogel arrived as a retcon mechanism, outstayed her welcome, and died anticlimactically. Dexter made choices that felt engineered to produce tragedy rather than arising from believable psychology, such as letting a dangerous antagonist live despite exposure, clearing the path for Deb's demise. The finale itself contained moments some found haunting or even beautiful, like Dexter taking Deb's body out to sea as a final act of grief. But beauty does not excuse implausibility, and a scene that requires a hurricane, a hospital extraction, and an ocean disposal with no witnesses is not tragedy so much as logistical fantasy. The deeper critique is that the final season did not behave like an ending. The best years of Dexter delivered suspense, moral dilemmas, near discovery, and shocks that altered Dexter's life. A series finale should intensify that architecture. Instead, the final run often felt like another routine season until it suddenly demanded to be read as definitive. The result was emotional whiplash. Not because the ending concept was wrong, but because the narrative did not earn its own gravity. This is why later continuations provoke conflicted hope. If exile was the punishment, a follow-up risks diluting it by offering a cleaner death or a tidier arrest, closure as a checkbox rather than a reckoning. The audience asking for a courtroom season is not merely asking for plot. It is asking the franchise to stop hiding behind the neat fiction that Dokes is the Bay Harbor butcher as far as everyone is concerned, while Dexter remains the real dark passenger haunting the story. That line, tossed as irony, is the franchise's entire moral dodge in miniature. The scapegoat absorbs the myth, and the truth remains conveniently private. Dexter endures because the premise endures, a fantasy of control where evil is identifiable, guilt is measurable, and justice is clean. The franchise keeps selling that fantasy and then flinching from the one question that would make it honest. What does society do with a man who killed predators when the law failed? And what does society do when it realizes it enjoyed watching him do it? Until that question is staged in full, through public exposure, institutional response, and cultural fracture, every new continuation will keep inspiring the same reaction. Elaborate theories to impose coherence, and sharper sarcasm to cope with the fact that the story still refuses to finish its own sentence. Subscribe.